Revered and controversial, former U.S. top diplomat Henry Kissinger dies at the age of 100. Negotiations continue to... I'm Sumi Somaskanda. Thank you for joining us. And we do start with that breaking news. Former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has died at the age of 100. He served as America's top diplomat and national security advisor during the Nixon and Ford administrations. In a statement, Kissinger Associates, a political consulting firm that he founded, said the German-born former diplomat died in his home in Connecticut. The statement from Kissinger Associates did not give a cause of death. Here's a look back at his life from our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Henry.
To some, Henry Kissinger was one of the Cold War's most influential statesmen, who advised presidents and prime ministers for decades.
In considering the Ukraine issue.
To others, he was a war criminal. Whose ruthless defense of American interests cost thousands of lives. He was born Heinz Kissinger in Nazi Germany. His Jewish family fled to America in 1938. But the young Henry, as he became, returned to Europe fighting with the US Army. In peacetime, the soldier became a scholar at Harvard University, making his name arguing that nuclear weapons could be used in conventional wars.
I believe it is technically possible to conduct the resistance with a limited employment of nuclear weapons, though that is less desirable.
Today I am pleased to announce the first appointment of the White House staff.
It was President Nixon who brought him into government, first as National Security Advisor, then Secretary of State, a double act seeking to reshape the Cold War by balancing competing world powers. Kissinger drove America's re-engagement with communist China, paying secret visits to its leaders, paving the way for an historic first visit by a US president in 1972. He sought to improve relations with the Soviet Union through negotiations about trade and arms control. And in the Middle East, he coined a new phrase, shuttle diplomacy, as he flew between capitals to try to constrain Arab-Israeli conflict. His belief was in realpolitik, the idea that national self-interest trumped human rights or shared values.
No nation can make its survival dependent on the goodwill of another state.
All this brought him some global celebrity.
I don't stand on protocol. If you'll just call me Excellency, we'll be getting...
We believe that peace is at hand.
But Kissinger's fame became notoriety as he struggled to end America's involvement in the Vietnam War by bombing Cambodia. This cut supplies to North Vietnam, but also killed hundreds of thousands. His critics accused him of war crimes. His supporters welcomed a Nobel Peace Prize.
Nothing that has happened to me in public life has moved me more than this award.
He was criticised too for supporting authoritarian anti-communist leaders such as General Pinochet in Chile. He backed the coup that brought the general's brutal junta to power.
It was at the height of the Cold War, so that the United States could not be totally indifferent to the question of a communist regime in Chile.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Kissinger was considered so indispensable, he survived the Watergate crisis and was kept on by Gerald Ford. But he fell out of favour in Washington, loathed by the left, distrusted by the right, and began a life of lucrative consultancy. Thus, Henry Kissinger, a scholar and statesman, a cynic at times cavalier with people's lives, above all a diplomat, always ready to talk.
Henry Kissinger has died at the age of 100. And we can speak now to Ambassador Winston Lord. He served as National Security Advisor, Assistant Secretary of State, and Ambassador to China. Ambassador, very good to have you on the program. You were the special assistant to Dr. Kissinger. So first of all, I'd like to get your reaction to this news of his passing.
Well, obviously, I react both on the global level and on a personal level. I think America has lost a tireless champion for its national interest. The world has lost a tireless advocate for peace, and I've lost a cherished friend and mentor. So obviously we take solace in the fact he lived a full 100 years and had an extraordinary career and a wonderful family life. So it's not tragic in the sense of premature death, but nevertheless, it's a great personal loss to me and I think to the world.
Ambassador, I want to come back to his professional legacy, but first, personally, what stands out to you about your friendship with Dr. Kissinger?
Well, he's had more influence on me than any other people except my own family. I was a young 30-year-old when I joined his national security staff and worked by his side for 8 years. And in the course of that, he was my mentor, but I used to joke he was also my tormentor because he was extremely demanding. He stretched my nerves and my patience, but he also stretched my abilities, my capabilities, and my horizon. So I'm always grateful to him, not only for the success I was able to share in with him, but also what he taught me for the rest of my life in terms of strategic analysis and working in the fields of diplomacy.
We've just been looking at some images, actually, of the two of you working together. I want to ask you about that monumental trip to Beijing, that secret trip that you accompanied Dr. Kissinger on. Tell us more about what you remember from that trip.
Well, I've had a lot of, fortunately, dramatic moments in my life, but that probably topped them all. We went secretly from Pakistan. And of course, I always claim, and Henry admits, that I got to China before he did. No American official had visited China since 1949, 22 years. But as the Pakistani plane carrying us secretly to Beijing crossed the Chinese territorial demarcation, I was in the front of the plane and Henry was in the back. So I said I was the first American official to go to China. But of course, it was dramatic. It upset the geopolitical, it was an earthquake, a very positive move for American foreign policy, for the morale of the American people. It helped us improve relations with the Soviet Union by gaining their attention, by dealing with their adversary. It helped bring the end of the war in Vietnam. It made Kissinger a national and international figure. So I think it was a major hinge point, both for him personally, dramatic for me, particularly since my wife is Chinese and from Shanghai, so I was going back to her native land, and of course in global history. So that trip in its drama, of course it was secret, the James Bond aspect, but also meeting the Chinese leaders for the first time after 22 years and paving the way for the Nixon trip was really one of the highlights of my life.
Ambassador, you called Dr. Kissinger an ambassador for peace, that being part of his legacy. You will know, of course, that he is a deeply controversial figure as well. He's been called by some of his critics a war criminal, criticized for a lack of moral compass in his foreign policy approach. What do you think of that?
Well, of course, I totally disagree with it. Like any person of great stature, he did have flaws, but he monumentally contributed to world peace and to American interests. To say that someone had no moral compass who lost 15 of his family members in the Holocaust is absurd. He worked on human rights behind the scenes and not publicly. He often had to balance off geopolitical interests, as many presidents and leaders did during the Cold War, by working with unsavory partners in order to balance the Soviet Union. And there were other controversial decisions. But I would argue that peace and stability is the greatest human right of all. And he paid attention to human rights, but often quietly. But there's no question he put great emphasis on stability and the difficult trade-offs you had to make.
Ambassador, one more question. He did spend many of his later years in life defending his record against some of these criticisms. What do you think he would want to see his legacy to be?
Well, I think he'd want to see that he helped to transform American foreign policy. You have to remember, when he and Nixon came into office, they inherited a very difficult landscape. We had a president who had resigned. We had assassinations. We had the Vietnam War and rise home. We had no contact with China. We had difficult relations with the Soviets. We had declining influence in the Middle East. And all that, he, with the presidents, of course, Nixon and Ford, turned all that around. More stable relations with Moscow, opening to 1/5 of the world's people, ending the war on the best possible basis at the time, shuttling in the Middle East. And above all, one of his greatest accomplishments, people tend to forget, is that in the Watergate period, and your leader mentioned this, he didn't just survive. He survived because he was trusted. He was not involved in that. And so he was the one leading figure in the government that could hold this country together and our foreign policy together during a tremendous constitutional crisis. And during that period, he was a hero to almost everybody here and abroad.
Okay.
But revisionist history has set in, and some of his critics are going after him, of course, but I think he stands as a giant.
Ambassador Lord, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on BBC News.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's get another perspective now with Thomas Schwartz. He's a distinguished professor of history at Vanderbilt University with a focus on U.S. foreign policy, international relations, and U.S. presidencies. Thomas, really good to have you on. I think you were just listening to our previous interview as well. I wonder what you think of those assessments of Dr. Kissinger's legacy.
Well, I have enormous respect for Ambassador Lord, who I spoke with when I wrote a biography of Henry Kissinger. And so I understand very much his perspective. I take probably a slightly more critical view, but as a historian, I recognize that Kissinger had an enormous impact. He was one of the most consequential, in fact, the most consequential American diplomat of the 20th century. And his legacy is a mixed one. I think he did do some extraordinary achievements, particularly in the Middle East. And I think in terms of lessening the nuclear danger by opening up relations with with China and then with the Soviet Union. But I also think that in certain respects, for example, in Vietnam and in Chile, the results were much more mixed and negative. But I think on balance, Kissinger was a force for constructive leadership in the United States' foreign policy.
Thomas, let's talk about the Middle East in particular, because he coined that term shuttle diplomacy. How do you think that stands up today, especially given the current conflict that we're seeing?
Well, I think it actually stands up rather well. Kissinger, remember, there had been major wars in the Middle East when Kissinger began his shuttle diplomacy, and those wars were the Yom Kippur War of 1973 threatened to become a superpower confrontation. And Kissinger, through his diplomacy there, was able to bring a measure of stability and peace to the Middle East by taking Egypt, by forging a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel and a disengagement agreement with Syria. He did not deal with the Palestinian question, and that was not as directly on the table then when he was active as it would become later. But I think in many respects he created the structure that allowed things like Oslo and the beginnings of a process to create a two-state solution. So I think actually his contribution in the Middle East was quite constructive, and I think it's probably the most significant legacy he left.
I want to ask you more about the controversy. We know that he's deemed a realpolitiker, someone who believed more in function and pragmatism than perhaps the moral arguments for American diplomacy. But when you think about some of the aspects that you mentioned, from Vietnam to Chile, also to the Shah in Iran, the support there that some accuse for leading to the revolution in Iran as well, how did he look back at those criticisms of how he conducted American foreign policy?
Well, I think he could be fairly defensive when you spoke with him about these things, and I recognize that. No leader likes to be accused of all sorts of crimes or misadventures, especially when you were no longer in power. I mean, what happened to the Shah? Kissinger was not involved then, and this type of thing. But I think on the whole, he tended to have very few regrets about his leadership in foreign policy, and he believed that what he did was it served the national interest of the United States, and that the Cold War was on, and that it required oftentimes difficult choices, sometimes choices between a lesser evil. And he certainly was he could quite forcefully defend those choices.
And Thomas, what about his life after being a statesman? I just saw this interview that he did recently with Axel Springer saying that Germany had let in too many migrants and talking about anti-Semitism in that country. I mean, that was certainly a controversial period of his life as well.
You mean his post,
yes.
the time that he left office? He actually, of course, he was involved very much as a private consultant, often to many countries. But in fact, he was visiting China just a few months ago. Yes, he did play a role in that, and he commented on political issues often. He was completely he did. Unlike many of his generation, of German Jews of his generation, he maintained a strong tie to Germany and was concerned about developments there. And so I'm not surprised to hear that he had commented on that.
All right, Thomas, really interesting to get your perspective on this as well. Thank you so much for joining us on BBC News.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC.